Hello everyone. Welcome to the lecture titled Globalization and Historical Process in Indian Context. This lecture is part of a paper on media and globalization. This lecture will provide an overview of the nature of India's interaction with the forces of globalization. Before doing that, the lecture also will comment on the paradoxical nature of globalization as a phenomenon. We know that the word globalization basically refers to greater integration of the globe and connectivity engendered by technologies of communication. This integration has brought people, cultures, and communities close to each other. The history of this integration may be considered to be around 2 centuries old and treated as coterminous with capitalism and industrialization. However, it was believed that the global integration and connectivity reached a qualitatively new stage since the 1960s, when the first satellite went into space. The new technological breakthrough was so powerful that it cast its shadow on all the facets of human life. A clear and crisp understanding of globalization precludes us because of its deceptive nature. At one end, it is really monostranded in the sense that it has been engendered primarily by technology. In this sense, it may be considered a product of modern scientific technological initiatives. On the other hand, it is truly multidimensional. Its impact can be seen in areas as diverse as culture, lifestyle, consumption patterns, sports, tourism, entertainment, relationships, politics, dilution of national sovereignty, and new imagination of democracy, sharpening of identity conflict, new claims made by groups and communities, among others, new patterns of migrations and mobility, emergence of a world political system, new international bodies such as the UN, emergence of global socio-political movements such as the one for the environment. Globalization has also brought about new encounters between religions and also between religious faith and irreligiosity. New issues have emerged cutting across the state systems and which require international cooperation, such as tackling of global terrorism and management of the environment. This may be treated as some of the major paradoxes of globalization. It pushes us to the fore the forces of homogenization and differentiation at the same time. It increases the power and consolidates the domination of state systems and multinational corporations. But it also unleashes and activates forces against them. We also know that globalization from above and globalization from below operate at cross purposes and try to undermine each other. Yet they both emanate from within the same matrix. It creates multiple links and connectivities across groups and communities. It opens up the possibilities of dialogues between the local and the global. Yet these opportunities produce their own tensions and anxieties. They also create a resistance against globalization. It was believed by the 18th century philosophers of the Enlightenment that the increase in knowledge about the social and natural world would also bring increasing control over them. This control was seen as the key to human happiness. It was believed that with new knowledge and power, humans would be able to eventually guide their collective destiny in the desired direction. However, in reality, the real world as it emerged, turn out to be much more open, contested, and contingent. As Anthony Giddens has said, it is a world where opportunity and danger are balanced in equal measure. One way of unraveling the multiple paradoxes of globalization is to see it as sui generis, automated and a self-driven phenomenon. After being set into motion, it becomes independent of the human agencies, forces, and the institutions which may have claimed to initiate it and which claim to operate it. It is not at the service of any of them beyond a certain period. It cannot be indefinitely controlled and manipulated by any force beyond a point. In this sense, it is not so much a project requiring a blueprint and self-conscious operators as a process, a dynamic trajectory with a life of its own, drawing upon a multiple available resources, constantly interacting with different forces and institutions in its journey ahead. One definition of globalization identifies it as a social process in which the controls of geography on social and cultural arrangements recede, and in which people are becoming increasingly aware that they are receding. It has been argued that globalization stands at the intersection of two crucial binaries, modern versus pre-modern and West versus the rest. The two binaries are not identical. They are not wholly distinct. Either globalization is a concept whose meaning is quite entangled with few other concepts such as modernity, postmodernism, post-industrialism, and so on. However, whereas the concept of modernity has been elastic enough to lend itself to conceptual modification such as alternative modernity, multiple modernities, and also society-specific modernity such as Indian modernity, European modernity, and so on. However, no such permutations, hyphenated combinations have been applied to the concept of globalization. We do not hear of concepts like Indian globalization or alternative globalization or even multiple globalizations. It would appear that there is something truly global about globalization. It is understood to be such a huge, all-pervasive phenomenon that there cannot be an alternative to it. We cannot pluralize the phenomenon by using the concept multiple globalizations. All the possible pluralities are easily subsumed within globalization. There is but one globalization. The point now is to understand it without either questioning it or endorsing it. That being the case, it is a real challenge to understand globalization specifically in relation to one particular society, India, with its own specific history. The theme, India's relationship with globalization, can be dealt with by raising two questions. One, what has been the nature of India's encounters with the forces of globalization through its history? Two, how has globalization affected Indian society and its institutions? India's historic encounters with globalization, that is, India's encounters with globalization, can be understood better by getting a good sense of one of the variables in this encounter, that is India. On the scale of nation states, India is only one of the nearly 200 nation states that inhabit the world. But if we take humans as a unit of enumeration, then India accounts for nearly 18% of the total world population and is second only to China. In fact, India and China put together constitute nearly 40% of the entire humanity. Prior to 1947, when India was partitioned into two nation states of India and Pakistan, India was the largest country in the world. On a scale of the type of society, India should be considered a civilizational society. It is marked by strong continuities through its long history. Long phases of its history were marked by continued dynastic rule over large parts of the territory, large empires such as the Mauryan Empire, 3rd century to 2nd century BC, Gupta Empire, that is 4th to 5th century BC, and the Mughal Empire 1526 till 18th century brought large areas into single domination. Factors such as prolonged dynastic rule, political and institutional continuities, religion and technology provided the connecting links among different regions and communities through its long history. Yet, another important feature of Indian history is the fact of prolonged contact and dialogue with outsiders. The phases of isolation have been few and far in between. The evolution of society happened primarily as a result of contact, dialogue, and exchange with multiple groups and cultures that came from outside. Many travelers, conquerors, rulers, and traders influenced Indian culture and were in turn influenced by it. The dialogical traditions have been generally strong in Indian history. The major and lasting changes happened not through rupture and displacement, but through assimilation and incorporation. Old and new harmonized and coexisted with each other. They still do. If the fact of relative centralization, continuities, and connectivities was one important feature of India, its diversity was another. The diversities accompanied the connectivities through the centuries of Indian history. As Nehru identified this phenomenon as unity in diversity in his epical Discovery of India, written in jail in the early 1940s. Yet another way of identifying the same phenomenon is to consider it a mix of syncretism and plurality. The single feature of Indian society and history has been largely responsible in shaping the nature of India's encounters with the forces of globalization. It has been argued that not all societies respond to the pressures of globalization in a similar manner, and that large, plural, inclusive, and dialogical societies are generally better placed in utilizing the opportunities offered by globalization and in coping with the pressures and tensions generated by it. Let us now zoom out and look at the patterns of India's interactions with forces that came from outside. As earlier we stated, interactions and dialogues with outsiders was not something alien to Indian society. India did not grow in isolation at any point in its long recorded history. Yet the encounters that developed since the 19th century were different and unprecedented in some senses. Therefore, the history of India's encounters with forces from outsiders may be conveniently started since the 19th century. We may identify 4 different phases of this encounter. The 19th century, the first half of the 20th century till India's independence, 1947 to 1991, and the period since 1991 onwards. The 19th century India experienced profound and unprecedented challenges or changes in the material, socio-cultural, and intellectual life. The Indian economy lost its independence and was integrated to the economy of Britain and through it to global economy. This integration happened both at the level of trade and capital, and it completely subordinated the Indian economy to the industrial metropolitan economy of Britain. In time, this came to be called the colonization of Indian economy. However, at the level of ideas and institutions, new exposures also created a new awareness. Raja Ram Mohan Roy, in his major treatise written in Persian, Tuhafat-ul-Muwahhidin, began to extol the virtues of rationalism and universalism. The Indian intellectuals also initiated a significant critique of Indian traditions and of many religious practices based on superstition and bigotry. Almost all the evil practices that were practiced in the name of religion came under a sharp attack. At the same time, the Indian intellectuals were also wary of blindly adopting the culture and religion of the European conquerors. The Indian leaders undertook a serious philosophical journey in which they seriously tried to overcome the ill effects of the Indian traditions and religions. In other words, they wanted to transform the traditions in a modern direction. At the same time, they were also wary of colonial encroachment into Indian culture. This philosophical journey was like a tightrope walk in which the perils of both traditions and colonization were to be avoided. Likewise, a quest for universalism was to be pursued, but in a way which would not endorse European domination on the rest of the world. Many decades later, Rabindranath Tagore, in his famous essay Crisis in Civilization, celebrated universalism, but by highlighting essentially the non-European, that is Japan, Middle East and Afghanistan, roots to it. Thus, from the very early on, Indian thinkers and intellectuals and the institutions they created explored complex and creative ways of celebrating the pan-human global consciousness, while remaining deeply suspicious and critical of European domination. This was an important feature of Indian response to forces initiating a global integration. In the second half of the 19th century, this trait found a much sharper and fuller expression. The new generation of Indian intellectuals, led by Dadabhai Naoroji among others, openly began to highlight the desirability of a modern industrial economy and its entire paraphernalia: banks, insurance, industries, global trade and capital. But they refused to look upon the British rule as a blessing or as a positive force. They saw the British rule as an obstacle in the development of India as a modern economy and society. So, celebration of modern economy based on science and technology and a sharp criticism of the agents who brought it to the Indian shore was a part of the complex ways in which the Indian intellectuals responded to the initial forces of globalization. At around the same time, under the impact of modern technology, railways, telegraph, print, among others, Indian society began to be transformed. Urbanization, occupational mobility, social dislocations and disparities all began to be experienced by the Indian society. Leading sociologist S.C. Dubey has highlighted these aspects in his seminal work Social Change in India. Indians were quick to take to the print. The number of printed journals and periodicals increased manifold during the second half of the 19th century. Interestingly, print was used as a powerful medium through which the British rule and its institutions were subjected to a sharp critique, thus celebrating modernity and opposing colonialism and imperialism became an important component of Indian response to the 19th century forces of globalization. The same trend continued in the 20th century also. Indians launched a powerful anti-imperialist struggle against British imperialism under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi. During the course of the struggle, every effort was made to reach out to political and ideological forces outside India. Indian national movement was perhaps the only anti-imperialist struggle that developed its own foreign policy and that was completely opposed to the foreign policy of the British rulers. The Indian national movement upheld the right of all colonies for self-determination and opposed European domination everywhere. The early founders actually worked towards a unity of all colonial countries of Asia and Africa suffering under European domination. During the Second World War, that is during 1939 to 45, Gandhi developed an interesting habit of reaching out and making direct appeals through letters to the people of China, Japan and America. He even wrote a letter to Hitler urging him to prevent the war, which may reduce humanity to a savage state. The national movement consistently took a stand on the Spanish Civil War against fascism and also against Japanese encroachment into China. Nehru was known for his international commitment. However, in their endeavour to connect to the world outside, the Indian leaders took great care to make a distinction between what may euphemistically be called the baby and the bathwater. They reaffirmed their commitment to the values of secularism, rationalism and universalism, but they also maintained the fierce opposition to imperialism and colonialism as aspects of European domination. In other words, they did not throw the baby with the bathwater. They segregated the two, rejected the bathwater of European domination and fully adopted the baby of the universalist values of the Enlightenment. Perhaps the simplest and yet the most powerful expression of the global commitment came in early 1947 when India, still a British colony, decided to host the Asian Relations Conference in Delhi. Gandhi, who was present at the conference, dreamt of one single world as the most desirable scenario of the future. He said in his speech, "I will not like to live in this world if it is not to be one. I should like to see this dream realized in my lifetime. I hope that all the representatives who have come here will strive their level best to have only one world. They will have to think out ways and means for achieving this goal." The next phase of India's encounter began immediately after 1947 as an independent and sovereign nation state. Under the leadership of Nehru, India began to reach out to the world outside. The economic policies of the new nation states were marked by self-reliance and restrictions on the entry of global capital. However, at the level of politics and diplomacy, we find that began to fashion a new international role for India. Opposition to any form of colonialism, non-alignment in the superpower rivalry and working for greater global cooperation were some of the features of the way independent India began to relate to the world outside. While commenting on the nature of the new global order and India's role in it, you can say that a speech Nehru that was delivered after the interim government was formed in September 1946. The world, in spite of its rivalries and hatreds and inner conflicts, moves inevitably towards closer cooperation and the building of a one world commonwealth. It is for this one world that free India will work, a world in which there is the free cooperation of free people and no classes or group exploits another." Unquote. These were some of the words that remain as the cornerstone of India's relationship with the world outside. Transformations in Indian society, that is, in the period after 1991, in which the Indian society has become closely entangled with globalization. The society as a whole has experienced an unprecedented transformation. Never before has the pace of change been so rapid. These changes are connected to the new economic policies adopted by the Indian state in 1991. The new policies sought to restrict the control of the state in the economic activities and also to integrate the Indian economy with the global economy. To take one example, 3 major acts of withdrawing state control in the 1990s really galvanized the society, allowing private actors in the telecom sector, private channels on the television and private players in airlines, all within space of 1 year, tremendously increased the reach of all the 3 to large chunks of the population. The last 3 decades have exposed the Indian society and its people frontally and directly to the forces of globalization. To put it briefly, the following things have happened. By the late 1980s, the Indian economy was in a state of deep crisis. It was felt that the only way out of the crisis was to open up the economy, liberalize it, encourage private initiative, and also connect it to the global market. This required fundamental changes in economic policies and in the allocation of resources. The results of the new policies began to show up in a decade's time. The size of the economy increased tremendously. The new changes brought about growth and new opportunities, but they also resulted in increasing disparities between the rich and the poor. It was clear that the benefits of new economic changes were being distributed quite unevenly. The critics of globalization called it the predatory phase of capitalism, which would inevitably edge out the poor and also deprive them of whatever protection they could expect from the state. The new changes were not confined to the urban areas and classes. They also entered the villages and began to transform the rural economy and society. This imparted dynamism to the rural areas but also rendered them socially vulnerable. How did Indian society cope with such new changes? There is no doubt that different groups have made full use of new opportunities. But the unevenness in the distribution of new benefits has also created resentment against globalization. On a very cursory observation, the following trends can be noticed. There have been changes in lifestyle, consumption patterns, cultural practices, and also in the observation of religious rituals. The entry of the electronic media and the market forces have altered rural life very significantly. The process of globalization has also altered people's orientation towards political institutions such as the state, the civil society, and democracy. Often there has been a tendency in people's perception to conflate state with globalization. Quite often, the resentment produced by some of the offshoots of globalization has been diverted against the state. Generally speaking, people, particularly the farmers, have expected the state to provide protective mechanisms in order to enable them to participate in the globalization process. Any failure in this respect has turned people against the state. In general, the disenchantment against the state has increased in the era of globalization. There also has been a sharpening of identity politics as a result of globalization. The economic forces have brought cultural influences which, unlike in the past, have penetrated into the core of the community life. As a result, the forces of globalization have also produced deep cultural anxieties. The possibility of a loss or a dilution of culture along with the growing disparities have provided a new fillip to identity politics. The age of globalization in India is also the age of sharpening of identitarian concerns. So it is clear that the changes brought about by globalization have both integrative and disruptive potentials. Spread of the market network, communication revolution, increase in the size and importance of the middle classes, economic growth, spread of democracy, and the diffusion and penetration of the party politics to the local level all have integrated potentials. At the same time, increasing disparities, unevenness, dislocation, cultural anxieties, and identity politics are quite capable of tearing apart of the social fabric. Globalization contains both cohesion and disruption in its own. However, it has been argued that certain features of Indian society may enable it to cope with the pressures generated by globalization. The diversity and syncretism contained in the social structure may enable it to work towards an adaptive reconciliation with the forces of globalization. Also, the democratization of the society and its extension to the rural areas has also created an empowerment of the people. As a result, people have resorted to the democratic opinion in their engagement with globalization. However, it is still early to predict the full force of social effects unleashed by globalization. But we may still end on an optimistic note, quoting a sociologist, Professor Yogendra, saying, "The linkages, both visible and invisible, defining the cultural interdependence among communities and regions in India which have existed historically, reinforce instead of threatening the national identity." These bonds seem to become stronger as India encounters the forces of modernization and globalization. We can now sum up what we have learnt in this lecture. This lecture has tried to make the following points. Globalization needs to be understood as an all-encompassing, comprehensive phenomenon containing within it all the pluralities and contradictions. These contradictions are of the very essence of globalization. Some of the essential features of Indian society have placed in a position of advantage in its engagements with the forces of globalization. Large size, historic continuities, plurality along with syncretism, and a long tradition of dialogue with outsiders have all created accommodative spaces within society. These spaces have been the major institutional reservoirs in India's encounters with the forces of globalization. Since the 19th century, Indian leadership adopted a very complex approach towards all exogenous influences. On the one hand, they welcomed and endorsed the ideas of enlightenment such as rationalism, secularism and universalism, but they firmly rejected imperialism and colonialism as aspects of European domination. Thus, they welcomed the positive and progressive trends emanating from Europe and rejected forces of domination. After India became independent, the leaders fashioned a new role for India at the global arena. As India was projected as a country committed to anti-colonialism, independence for all countries, and global peace and cooperation. At the level of politics and diplomacy, India remained committed to a global world order based on freedom, peace and harmony. It was, however, after 1991 that Indian society was fully exposed to the forces of globalization. The new developments affected the political, economic and the cultural lives of the people. They also penetrated into the villages, significantly altering the rural lives. It is difficult to make an assessment of the overall impact of the new changes as we are still in the midst of the transformation. However, the new changes unleashed by globalization have brought both the integrative and the disruptive forces to the surface of society. New economic opportunities, extension of market networks, increase in the size of middle class, and greater democratization have the potentials of integrating in Indian society. But unevenness and disparity and cultural anxieties and a sharpening of identity politics are quite capable of tearing apart the social fabric. It is still early to conjecture which of the two influences, integrative or disruptive, will be the dominant element in India's tryst with globalization. This brings us to the end of the lecture. We hope that you enjoyed the present lecture. For more information, please refer to the e-text of the lecture and attempt all the questions given in the end. For further study, do go through the extended reading list provided with this lecture. Thank you.